and welcome to the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. I'm Mark Rees, and on each episode, I investigate a different, weird, and wonderful subject. And on this episode, we are going to look at three traditional folkloric ways of protecting yourself from the supernatural, from the forces of evil, be they spirits, fairies, goblins, werewolves, vampires, headless horsemen, or something even more shocking, even more unspeakable. Whatever it is that might be coming after you, whatever paranormal creature you've upset, by the end of this episode, in about 30 minutes' time if all goes to schedule, you will be perfectly equipped to fend them off by using this centuries-old Welsh wisdom that could very well save your life. And even if it doesn't, it should make for an enthralling, a spine-chilling podcast episode. And so, to begin at the beginning. And we are going to start with the easiest form of protection to remember. You have no excuses for forgetting this one. And it's something I've mentioned a number of times on this podcast over the years. And it simply involves invoking a single word. Just a single word, maybe two, that could very well save you and your loved ones from a terrifying paranormal ordeal. And that one word is God. Or, if you wanted to use the two-word alternative, Jesus Christ. Yes, simply invoking the Lord's name in your dark hour could save the day. At least, that's what the faithful Christian folk of Wales believed in days gone by. And not just in Wales. And to prove this, there is a recorded account of bad spirits, in inverted commas there, bad spirits who actively went out of their way to prevent somebody from uttering the words aloud in order, I'm assuming, so they could go about their evil deeds. Now, this takes place during the boom days of spiritualism in the Victorian age. When mediums communicated with the other side, they spoke to the spirits in their parlours, much like they do today, of course. But back then, it was much more mainstream, much more common. There was no hiding the Ouija board under the bed. You could just pop down the street and pop and see your medium next door to the shop where you picked up a loaf of bread. The good old 19th century. And it was during these times that our Welsh folklorist recalls a rather dramatic seance that took place in New York in 1867. Yes, we're going global with this one, over to the Big Apple. And they quote the American author, Mr. Fitzhugh Ludlow, who writes about a female medium who was seemingly, to those in attendance, taken over by a bad spirit, what we might now describe as being possessed by a bad spirit that was inside of the medium. And those in the room implored her to exorcise this spirit by simply pronouncing the name of Christ. However, this bad spirit would not let her do so. This bad spirit was in control, and there was no way she was going to be spouting out words that it found offensive. And so, to quote, she stumbled and stammered over this test in a most embarrassing way. And finally, she emerged from her trance with the holy name unspoken, and the bad spirit had fled. And we are told by our folklorist that, like many others who assert their unbelief in such things, their unbelief in spiritualism, Mr. Ludlow was intensely impressed, not just a little bit, intensely impressed by this phenomenon. So Mr. Ludlow, we can assume, was a little bit skeptical beforehand, but even he couldn't doubt what he saw with his own eyes, what he heard, or what he didn't hear rather, with his own ears. He saw this medium seemingly taken over by a bad spirit, and a bad spirit that would not let her say the Lord's name aloud. Now, this wasn't, of course, limited simply to ghosts. I said this will work on a multiple of paranormal creatures. It was also used widely on fairies, which we will now turn our attention to, and other similar supernatural creatures. And if you're wondering why the word God, the name of the Lord, would have such an effect on these creatures, because maybe you can see it with the bad spirits, the demons we might call them, that makes sense from a Christian perspective. But fairies, what have they they got to do with anything? What have vampires got to do with anything? Well, our folklorist does offer an explanation as to why this is a silver bullet, as it were, a catch-all for all supernatural beings. And that is the more vengeful God of the Old Testament. A God you do not want to mess with. A God feared by those who love and worship him. And as such, even the faithful were wary about uttering his name aloud. And according to our folklorist, to quote, they used alternative names instead, such as Jehovah, the Almighty, the Supreme Being, etc., to refer to the avenging God of Jewish theology. And if the faithful are going to such effort to avoid saying the word God here, there, and everywhere, you can only imagine the effect it must have had on those who were not faithful. Or, as our folklorist puts it, it is easy to see the connection with the exorcising power of that name upon all evil spirits. And it should be said, it wasn't only the Lord's name that people were hesitant about using, but this also applied to the name of the devil. People did not like using the name of the devil, of Satan, aloud either. And if they did mention it, they would often spit afterwards. And our folklorist tells us that the name of the devil is similarly provided with euphemisms, some of which, such as the old boy, are not of a sort to offend that personage's years. And until recently, the word devil was deemed almost as offensive as the word God when profanely used. So, the word devil could also be offensive to people's ears, of course, for very different reasons. You could call him the old boy. That was far more civilized. But it is important to bear in mind that context is key here. So simply using the word God wasn't in and of itself bad, but when it was profanely used, then it took on a different dimension. Now, moving on to our second form of protection. And I did promise some fairy lore, so here we go. And we are told that a popular protection from the encroachments of fairies is the eithin. E-I-T-H-I-N. Eithin, or prickly furs, common in Wales. And eithin is better known across the English-speaking world as gorse. G-O-R-S-E, gorse, which I am sure many of you will be familiar with anyway, but just in case, if not, according to a quick internet search, common gorse is a large evergreen shrub covered in needle-like leaves and distinctive coconut-perfumed yellow flowers during the spring and summer, which explains the name prickly furs. These things have pointy needle-like leaves, which might also help explain why they repel such creatures as fairies, the smaller creatures, because we are told it is believed that the fairies cannot penetrate a fence or hedge composed of this thorny shrub. An account illustrating this, and otherwise curious in its details, was given in 1871 by a prominent resident of Anglesey. So we are off to Anglesey, off to Ynys Môn for our next tale, and it goes like this. One day, some 30 years ago, Mrs. Stanley went to one of the old houses to see an old woman she often visited. And the house in which she lived is described rather unflatteringly as a wretched hovel, and it was so unusually dark when she opened the door to let herself in that she couldn't see her friend. Instead, she had to call out. She called out to old Betty Griffith, but getting no answer from old Betty Griffith, she entered the house. She entered the room, which was illuminated by a little tiny window, which only had one pane of glass on the far side of the room, and as such, there was only a feeble amount of light in that room, and only a feeble amount of heat, with a few cinders burning in the grate. But nevertheless, this small amount of light was enough for her to see the recess where Betty Griffiths kept her bed, or at least used to keep her bed, because there was no longer a bed in that dark and dingy recess. So, to recap quickly, she's arrived at her friend's house. She's arrived at Betty Griffiths' house, which, even by 1871 standards, sounds quite run down. It's dank and dark, and more curiously, the bed, which is usually in the recess, is not there. So where has the bed gone? And where has the occupier gone? Well, to continue, she then saw the bed, she saw it, but To her surprise, she saw it entirely shut out by a barricade of thick gorse, so closely packed and piled up that no bed was to be seen. So the bed was completely surrounded and obscured from sight by this thick wall, this thick barricade of gorse. And again, she called Betty Griffith, but no response came. She looked round the wretched room. The only symptom of life was a plant of the wandering Jew, or to give it its correct name, if I can pronounce it, and I probably can't, Saxifraga tricolor. And apologies to any gardeners listening if I've just massacred the name of your favourite flower, so I promise I will not attempt it again. Let's just call it the plant. That plant that the poor people, we are told, dearly loved to grace their windows with. And in this particular dark and dingy house, in Betty Griffiths' house, it was planted in a broken jar or teapot on the window, trailing its long tendrils around, and here and there a new formed plant seemed to derive sustenance from the air alone. So this curious scene is getting curiouser and curiouser. The gorse is not the only plant doing crazy things in this room. We've also got that plant on the windowsill that is sprawling around the place. And to continue, as she stood, struck with the miserable poverty of the human abode, a faint sigh came from behind the gorse. She crept closer to the gorse and said, "Betty, where are you?" Betty instantly recognised her voice and ventured to turn herself round from the wall. Mrs. Stanley then made a small opening in the gorse barricade, which sadly pricked her fingers, so she cut herself trying to find a gap, or trying to create a gap through which to see her friend. And having done so, she saw Betty there on her bed and asked her, "Are you not well? Are you cold that you are so closed up?" Which seemed like a perfectly rational set of questions to ask someone hiding away on their bed like that. But Betty replied, "Cold? No, it is not cold, Mrs. Stanley. It is the Tylwyth Teg. They never will leave me alone. There they sit, making faces at me and trying to come to me." And just to interrupt quickly, the Tylwyth Teg, as regular listeners will know, is the Welsh name for the fairy folk. And if you'd like to know more about the Tylwyth Teg, please go back and check out the countless episodes I've recorded about them over the years. But the Tylwyth Teg, very briefly, is Welsh for the fairy folk, and they are seemingly playing tricks with Betty's mind. Is she imagining this, or are there small creatures there sitting and making faces and trying to get at her? Well, to continue, and Mrs. Stanley is quite keen to see these creatures for herself, it turns out. I mean, we don't know if she entirely believes her friend or not, or if she's just playing along to find out, but she does say, "Indeed, oh, how I should like to see them, Betty." But while she would dearly like to see the Tylwyth Teg, Betty has the opposite opinion, and she says, "Like to see them, is it? Oh, don't say so. Oh, but Betty, they must be so pretty and good." Good? They are not good, Betty assures her, and by this time we are told the old woman had gotten quite excited, and Mrs. Stanley had a crafty plan with which to find out a little bit more about these potentially imaginary creatures, and that was if she threatened to leave. If her friend was genuinely scared, genuinely wanted for her to stay there and to keep her company, to keep the Tylwyth Teg away, she would beg her to stay and tell her everything she wanted to hear. So she says, "Well, I will go out. They will never come if I am here." And old Betty replied sharply, "No, do not go. You must not leave me. I will tell you all about them, how they come and plague me." And she does just that. And she begins by saying, "Sadly, if I am up, they will come and sit on the table. They turn my milk sour. They spill my tea, and there's no worse a crime that you can do to an old Welsh woman than spill her tea. And she doesn't even get peace in her bed. They even come into her bed," she says. Or rather, around her bed. They surround her bed, and then they mock her. Now, this activity, be it real or imagined, sounds relentless. It is continuous and at times terrifying. She can't even go to bed to get some peace, which of course explains why the gorse is there. And without going off on too much of a tangent, but this kind of activity, the activity described here of things being moved around and disturbed, is from this century onwards, increasingly attributed to a different kind of unwanted visitor. What was attributed to the fairy folk is increasingly blamed on something called a poltergeist. So it's worth bearing in mind that while some of the language, while they might be saying fairies, if the exact same case were reported 100 years later, I think there's a very good chance it would be blamed on something else. But tangent over. And for the purposes of this story, she believes it's the fairies. It is the Tylwyth Teg. And Mrs. Stanley, now that she's getting some straight answers, or seemingly straight answers out of her friend, wants to know more about this protective gorse. And she says, "Betty, tell me, what is all this gorse for? It must have been great trouble for you to make it all so close." To which she replies, "It is to keep them off." As if she stated the obvious, it is to keep them off. They cannot get through this. It pricks them so bad, and then I get some rest. So the gorse, it would seem, doesn't have some inner properties that helps it to repel supernatural invaders. Rather, those prickly bits just keep away those pesky little creatures. This sounds like much more of a natural form of defense, and it certainly seems to be working, although while it's keeping the fairies away, it's also keeping Betty restricted to within that circle. She is a prisoner in her own home, in her own bed. And with that, pleased with the answers she'd received, her visitor decides now is a good time to leave. She replaces the gorse that she'd disturbed, and she leaves old Betty Griffith happy, which is a strange choice of words, but happy in her device. Maybe she is happy because she is protected, but she leaves her happy. And this is where this account ends, which frankly is a little anticlimactic. I mean, how much of a good friend would leave them in that state? Wouldn't they, even if they do leave, wouldn't they return? Wouldn't they look deeper into this? Well, maybe they did, and it wasn't recorded, and we just don't know what happens next. But as far as the folklorist recorded, Mrs. Stanley closed that gap. She closed that barricade in the gorse flowers to prevent any Tylwyth Teg from entering, heads back out the door the way she came, and leaves Betty to it. The problem is yours, not mine. And one glaring there's lots of glaring questions, I guess, if you wanted to pick holes in this story. But one that really does stand out is if the gorse does work, and it does seem to be working in this case, she does seem to be getting some peace with her bed barricaded in the gorse. It doesn't stop them from entering the house. So they are sitting on the table and they are taunting her inside the house, which must be making her life live in hell. So why not put a nice big ring of gorse all around the house? Never mind just the bed. Circle the entire house. I mean, I don't know how practical that might be, but if you are ever plagued by fairies or poltergeists even, hey, give it a go. However, if you don't fancy surrounding your entire house with gorse, and if the word of God isn't doing the trick and you are still being plagued by the forces of darkness, well, we have reached our third and final piece of invaluable advice if you find yourself in such a situation. And that is something that is relatively easy on the one hand, relatively difficult on the other. I am sure this would have been much simpler in centuries gone by, and anyone living in our big cities today, anyone living in New York today, might not find this as easy to do. But the third and final piece of advice is to move house. Yes, just move house. That's it. Nice and easy. And you'll be glad to know if you are worried about leaving some haunting behind for the new owners, you can do this with a clear conscience. Because we are told that a common means of getting rid of fairies is to change one's place of residence. The fair folk will not abide in a house which passes into new hands. So the fairy folk will not abide in a house which has been passed on to new hands, to new owners, to new occupants. And we have another example, another tale to illustrate this, and it goes like this. A story is told of a Merionethshire farmer who, being tormented beyond endurance by a Bwbach of a mischievous turn, reluctantly resolved to flit. And just to interrupt again quickly, but the word Bwbach is a specific kind of Tylwyth Teg. It's a household fairy, and again, it's something I recorded an entire episode about, however many years ago now, if you'd like to go and check that out afterwards. And the other word in that sentence that you might not be familiar with is flit. To flit, which isn't used that often nowadays. I mean, it's far more common a word than Bwbach, but nevertheless, it's not as popular now as it would have been in the 19th century. And it means to move property, usually in a secretive, shady way, as if you're running away from the bailiffs or something. You're going to flit away from the bailiffs. And that is what the farmer is thinking of doing because of this Bwbach. He is being tormented and he has decided to flit. But to continue, having consulted a wise woman at Dolgellau, he was advised to make a pretended flitting, which would have the same effect. So he was told not to really flit, just pretend to flit. She told him that all he needed to do was to give out that he was going to move over the border into England and then get together his cattle and his household goods and set out for a day's drive around the Arenig. So she tells him, don't flit, pretend you're flitting, pack up your cattle, effectively go for a long walk or a long drive, well, a very long walk or drive, a 24-hour walk or drive around the mountain. And when he gets back, the Bwbach might have taken the hint and gone. And I bet the sheep loved him or loved the wise woman for that one. Come on, we're just going for a quick walk, just a quick 24-hour walk for no good reason, and then back to where we started. But anyway, this wise woman claimed that the fairy, the Bwbach, would surely quit the house. When it realised the farmer had quit the house, and more than that, especially the cherry on the cake of this plan was that when it realised that it was living in the house of a proud-born Cymro who was leaving to go and live in the foreign land of the Sais, this would be too much for the Bwbach to bear. So there's a few words here I probably need to explain again certainly to my international audience, and it does put an extra twist into this story. Because the wise woman tells the farmer to make it perfectly clear, 100% clear, to this sprite that is bothering him, that not only is he leaving, but where he is going to. He is going to the land of the Sais. The land of the Sais, this dark, mysterious place just over the border from Wales, which is perhaps better known around the world today as England. Because the fairy would be so offended, so ashamed to share the house with a Cymro, a true honest Welshman who would give up his own land and go and live in England. Well, that would be more than the fairy could bear, we are told. And that is the end of the plan for now. And so the farmer did as he was told, and we are told he set out upon his journey, driving his cattle and sheep before him and leading the cart upon which his furniture was piled while his wife and children trudged behind. And I mentioned the feat of the cattle being forced to go on this pointless walk. Spare a thought also for the wife and the children who are trudging behind them. And you would expect that even if this plan does indeed work, he is going to be a very unpopular farmer in that household for some time. Come on, kids, just going for a quick 24-hour walk. But back to the tale, and when they reached Rhydyfen, a ford so called because of this legend, and to interrupt again quickly, I've done a lot of interrupting on this episode, but this ford is called Rhydyfen as a result of the story you are now being told, which means technically it's not called Rhydyfen yet at this point in the story, but it will be soon. And when they reached Rhydyfen, they met a neighbour who exclaimed, "Hello, Dewi! Are you leaving us for good?" Which would seem like a perfectly normal greeting in this part of Wales back in the day. Well, a perfectly normal greeting even today. "Hello, Dewi! Are you leaving us for good?" But before the farmer even has a chance to answer, there was a shrill cry from inside one of the churns, the milk churns that was being carried on the cart, on that cart of belongings. And this shrill cry that rang out said, "Yes, yes, we are flitting from Hendrevar to England, where we've got a new home." And this shrill cry was the voice of the Bwbach. The Bwbach had decided that it was going to flit with them. And more than that, the wise woman, it would appear, got it totally wrong about the land of the Sais, because this Bwbach seems quite excited to be moving to England. And while this does prove some of the lore correct, that these creatures will not stay in a house when you move out, you haven't got to worry about leaving a haunting behind in a house that's been abandoned. However, in this case, they might join you and travel with you to the new place. And the farmer's little plan to be rid of this Bwbach seemed to be a complete failure. He had failed. And with that, the good man sighed as he turned his horses about and went back to Hendrevar by the same road he came. And all that walking for the cattle, for the sheep, for the wife, for the children, and the horses, as we've just discovered, was for nothing. And on that sombre, tire-footed note, we've reached the end of the third and final tale, and our third and final piece of spirit-repelling advice. And while each of these pieces of advice are supposed to help you, I have just realised, I'm thinking aloud slightly here, but each story in this episode has ended up on a bit of a downer. And I try and avoid that. I try and leave you all on an upbeat note. But every story has ended badly on this episode. The bad spirits stopped the medium from invoking the power of God. In the second tale, Mrs. Stanley just left her friend behind, seemingly permanently trapped in a bed surrounded by ogling fairies. And finally, a farmer who, despite dragging his poor wife and kids and cows and sheep on a trek through the Welsh countryside, was still haunted by the devious Bwbach. Which does suggest that if you do find yourself in paranormal trouble, while these 3 tips might work, it's always worth having a backup plan. Maybe you need to combine all 3 together. And on that downbeat note, we've reached the end of another episode of the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you haven't already, please consider pressing the subscribe button. And if you really enjoyed it, you can support the podcast by rating it, reviewing it, and telling all your friends about it. And if you really, really liked it and you want to support it going forward, you can treat me to a coffee via my website, which is always very much appreciated. And as we are ending this episode on something of a downer, I do have a little bit of bad news again. As with the last episode, there is going to be a 4-week gap between this episode and the next episode, I am afraid. So if you are listening to this in real time, that means the next episode will be available June the 6th. If you are listening to this on catch-up, it makes no difference and you couldn't care less. But if you are one of those hardcore listeners waiting to listen to download on the day it's released, I am afraid there is going to be a bit of a gap for exactly the same reasons that I explained on the last episode, because, quite frankly, I am overwhelmed with deadlines right now and I need this time to catch up. But of course, in the meantime, there is well over 100 episodes that you can go back and check out. Maybe go back and listen to your favourite episodes. And as I always say, I love to know what you like and what you don't like, I guess, about the podcast. If you have any favourite episodes, please let me know and I will do my best to tailor future episodes around those. If you're gagging for more episodes about vampires or poltergeists or old women trapped in beds surrounded by gorse being picked on by fairies, let me know and I will see what I can do. And outside of this podcast, if you'd like more Ghosts and Folklore, you can follow me on social media. And as well as this podcast, I've also written a number of books about similar weird and wonderful subjects, which are available from all good bookshops, offline and on. And those books are partly to blame for me being slightly late with this podcast at the moment. And I will talk a bit more about my next book on the next episode, because that is being published in August. So it will be with us very soon. So there's a nice teaser to leave you all with. Tune in to the next episode to find out all of the secrets. And on that note, It just leaves me to say thank you very much for listening. Diolch yn fawr iawn am wrando. I've been Mark Rees. This has been my Ghosts and Folklore podcast, beaming to you from Wales to the world. And remember, if you do find yourself living in a haunted house, all you have to do is shout, oh God, inside it. Put up a big gorse barricade to protect it, and then tell the neighbours that you are leaving town, which, frankly, after all that shouting and all that gorse growing, they'll probably be glad to see the back of you. Until next time, no star.